The battle between the one formerly known as Shigaraki Tomura and America's #1 hero Star and Stripe continues. With the previous chapter, when faced by the villain, Star only saw one way forward, the way of her spiritual master, All Might, to smash. And so she and her squadron of military pilots immediately assumed a battle formation, as they were all prepared to have this be their final hurrah. The villain, on the other hand, still unsure of his own identity, believing himself to be both Shigaraki Tomura and All for One simultaneously, would not hesitate to make his move either, as he would concoct a Quirk combination attack comprised of radio waves, air cannon, and heavy payload, which was absolutely devastating and could easily wipe out a lesser hero battalion. Star had no trouble evading this, however, and would then begin to use her own quirk, New Order, what would allow her to assign a new rule to a designated target. And with it, she was able to make it so that the air no longer existed 100 meters ahead of her, effectively suffocating the villain, which was then followed by a barrage of laser fire from the various aircrafts. The villain would then combine the quirks Reflect and Scatter to send these shots back. However, Star would defend herself by making it so that she could hold on to the redirected laser. In doing so, a limitation of her quirk would be revealed to the villain, as now they were able to breathe once more. And so, believing this to be his opportunity to strike, he would make his move, but swiftly be punched directly in the face by Star. As it turns out, Star can only set new rules for up to 2 targets at once, and one that she usually has on herself is Super Strength. However, the strength isn't exactly on par with the likes of All Might. As it turns out, All Might in his youth saved her and her family from a villain attack. An attack we actually know from the beginning of the very first My Hero Academia theatrical film. An experience that inspired her to become the woman she is today. But having touched him, she would enforce a new rule upon him. If Shigaraki Tomura moves at all, his heart will stop. And at that moment, from within, there would be a conflict of dominance to be observed between the vestige of Shigaraki and that of All for One, which were now conjoined more so than ever, as Shigaraki's overwhelming hatred was to be the catalyst to their shared perfection. And with this, the villain would continue to move despite the rule Star had imposed upon him. And so it was clear to her now that he was no longer Shigaraki Tomura, as we would then see his hair grow tremendously as an outpour of power would subsequently follow. With this latest chapter, Star would recoil and make her way onto a different aircraft, again wondering what in the world was going on with her opponent. Meanwhile, he'd stand atop another and claim to now understand her quirk, that despite being revered to be the strongest quirk, it still has its limitations. From there, a bulk of the chapter would be dedicated to explaining how exactly the quirk works. And truthfully, I am having a hard time recalling any instance of a quirk's explanation in the story that required this much text. And this is on top of the fundamental explanation provided by the previous chapter. Anyways, the details of Star's quirk, New Order, are pretty much classified by the US government. But despite this, she is the #1 hero of America after all, so from all her public hero work, it's not too hard for a mind like All for One to discern certain bits about it. Once again, after touching a target and calling out his name, she can impose any rule of her choosing onto it. A godly quirk that some find difficulty even considering a quirk with how capable it truly is. But thanks to fighting her, the villain was able to figure out a whole lot. Firstly, there must be a limit to how much she can power up and strengthen her body, because if the power was truly limitless, she would have been able to kill him with that one punch earlier. So yeah, she's no Saitama. However, when it comes to weakening things, there doesn't seem to be much of a limit at all. From there, he would liken it to a barometer of sorts. He would presume that she probably can't set rules if her mouth was forced shut or if she was up against intangible things, but then again, there was a possibility that she could, but it would just be incredibly weak. Regardless, it seems like she possesses far greater control over things that are not biological. From there, he would deduce that the difference between setting rules for biological and non-biological targets more than likely has to do with the process of declaring its name. The reason it didn't work on him is because Star declared him to be Shigaraki Tomura, which he isn't anymore, not exactly anyways. When it comes to people and such, he places a rule based on their identity, which they must also recognize to be themselves as well. Whereas with inanimate objects, she is able to impose a rule with far less restraint because the target has no perception of self. He'd furthermore question the range and such, and then oddly enough, begin to ponder if it could be applied to Monchan as well. Monchan being his old family dog, who Tenko had unintentionally killed with his quirk. Strange, but that is a conversation for another time. The villain would then be delighted by the nearly limitless possibilities and was so excited to try the power out for himself, a sentiment that certainly belonged to the all-for-one aspect. At this point, the pilots would again turn to Star for direction because nothing was working on their enemy and his absurd regeneration. Star would then pause for a while before telling them to get into contact with Commander Akbar. The pilot would then bring up the fact that they were already going against orders, that to go that far would be more than pushing it, but Star was insistent. They needed to use this ace up their sleeve, that the special override order exists for this very purpose. As far as Star was concerned, this villain was more than an enemy of Japan. He is a worldwide threat, and as such she intended to destroy him in ways that were illegal in Japan. He had to die here and now. A very heavy sentiment for the #1 hero indeed. She would then playfully ask them to serve as her footholds until they were able to make it back to the ground, blowing a kiss and calling them her brothers. From there, one of the pilots would flash back to their first meeting, where an out-of-costume Star whose hair was down and muscles were all kinds of swole would declare that from that day onwards, she would be in charge of them, that they would lay their lives on the line together, and that they were her brothers. And so even now they were willing to fight to the bitter end alongside her. Star would then express that they did not know enough about him, and so they would need to engage and relentlessly go on the offensive. She would then impose a new rule. The atmosphere would solidify and become 1,000 times her size, as a massive version of Star would then take form. It wasn't visible to the villain, but he could tell that something was off. Star would then make her move, straight up clobbering her enemy, and she was just looking like the Cloud version of Mufasa over here. The villain would be sent flying. Star would think to herself that trying to accumulate damage on her opponent was pointless. Without his true name, she was limited in what she could do to him directly, and so she had to just destroy him the old-fashioned way. She would clap and flatten the man with tremendous force. She would then command her brothers to fire their lasers at her. She would then impose a new rule on them: harden and concentrate the lasers into a single beam. Her giant self would then wield this power like the mighty Olympian god Zeus and plunge it directly onto the villain, pulverizing him and pushing him directly into the depths of the water below. They would continue this onslaught of fire, but this was only to keep him in place. The damage was tremendous, sure, but if he could be defeated by this, then there is no reason Endeavor couldn't have put him down during the war. As just then, Star would hear the voice of Commander Akbar. He'd admit that he'd gotten too negligent when it came to dealing with her selfishness. But this time, the consequences for her actions would be far more severe than simply revoking her hero license, but Star did not care. Instead, she would ask if the preparations were complete. The commander would then respond by saying that she only had this one shot, that Japan had already been contacted, and it would be arriving very soon, which was just music to Star's ears. And Commander Akbar, who we would see look similar to Zoidberg from Futurama, would admit that Star was a hasty and selfish rule breaker. But at the same time, that's the reason their country shines. He would express that even All Might could not capture this villain, and so it was up to her. It was her time to surpass him. Simultaneously revealing her real name to be Kathy, as a framed photo of her being held by All Might as a child would be shown. And from there, we would also see it. The new model, hypersonic intercontinental cruise missile, Tiamat. He would tell her to make every single one count, as nothing was to be held back, and absolute destruction was to ensue, and that was the chapter. Oh my goodness, things are getting really crazy and out of hand here. Now maybe this is just me being the massive Dungeons & Dragons nerd that I am, but is this Horikoshi referencing the multi-headed chromatic evil queen of dragons herself? If so, I absolutely love it. Now to be completely honest with you, I am not sure what outcome of this fight would be most satisfying for me personally. A trend that I really don't like in this series is the introduction of a new character only for them to be brutally damaged and or destroyed in their first real encounter. It has happened to Best Jeanist, Crust, Miruko, the high-end Nomu, arguably Overhaul, and now potentially Star. Now, are these missiles going to be anything more than just an explosive gun show? I'm not really sure, but either way, no better opportunity will probably present itself. I'm liking Star more and more as we get to know her, and I just hope that she's able to have further interactions with the rest of our cast without ending up in a cast herself, or worse yet, a casket. Well, go ahead and let us know what you think about this chapter and the way this fight is progressing in the comments below, and how do you feel about the lengthy explanation in this one? Not exactly Jujutsu Kaisen levels of convolution and deposition, but at the very least it is a lot less simple than My Hero Academia tends to be. And don't forget, you can connect with us over on Twitter and Instagram, as well as our Discord server linked in the description below. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to Plot Armor with notifications on, because when it comes to bringing you some of the best My Hero Academia content on the platform, Plot Armor has you covered. As always, I'm Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.